Say good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Libby Sartain, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator for this session, which focuses on 2026 priorities for compensation and human capital committees and how boards can effectively navigate ongoing change. I'd like to know the answer to that myself a little bit, but as both a director and a former executive, I know firsthand that each new year brings a whole host of new developments and fresh challenges for us to consider, and the pace of change seems to be increasing and more uncertain. Today, we'll examine some of the key issues expected to shape the agenda next year, from shifting investor expectations to evolving pay-for-performance dynamics and to new leadership challenges and the growing importance of human capital strategy, culture, and oversight. Joining me for this discussion are two distinguished experts from Meyer. First, we have Jannice Koors. She's the Senior Marketing Director who brings more than 30 years of experience in executive comp, and Susan Sandlund, Managing Director and Leadership Development Expert, who also brings more than 30 years in supporting executive growth and succession planning. So I'm looking forward to a robust and engaging conversation and to your questions that you might submit for us to talk about at the end of the session. But before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Gonzalez, who's going to cover a few housekeeping items. Mary?
Thank you, Libby. Thank you so much for agreeing to moderate, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to bring this presentation with you guys and the Meyer team because I think that they're going to give you a lot of great information about how to prepare for those differing 2026 priorities. I'm sure the topic is going to drive a lot of amazing questions from you guys. As Libby mentioned, she's already got some questions in mind. But just as a reminder for you all, if you'd like to submit a question, go ahead and do so using the Q&A box. And that's on the right of your screen. And we have built some time in at the end to be able to get to those questions. I do want to note that by submitting your question with your name, you are allowing us to provide Meyer your contact information so that they can respond to you in a timely manner in case we can't get to your question at the end of the webinar. And also they'll be sharing some thought leadership with you guys in the future. The number one question that we always get is whether this webinar will be available afterwards. And I just want to say that yes, these slides are available in PDF form in the resources section, and we'll also show you a link to where you can see the webinar in 1 to 2 weeks post-webinar in our archives. That will be available at nacdonline.org/webinars and also on promeyer.com. For those of you who are certified directors, and I hope you are, and for our board fellows, your participation in today's webinar earns you 1 credit towards maintaining that NACD credential. You'll automatically receive the credit for your participation. Just please note that it takes you attending for at least 50 minutes to receive it, and it might take about 30 days for you to see that credit appear on your credentials. And speaking of our NACD's Director Certification Program, if you're interested in learning more or setting yourself apart as a high-performance director who wants to learn, stay on top of trends, this designation is a great way to do that. Just check out our webpage or contact your membership advisor. Finally, at the very end, we always ask you to help us by filling out a few evaluation questions. It will be available at the end of the webinar and also in the emails and the post-webinar. And we really do appreciate that feedback. The reason is we want to make these webinars better for you, and we want to hear about the types of topics that you're looking forward to seeing in the future. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to our experts. So Jan, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Mari, and thanks. Welcome to everybody for joining us. As we thought about this topic around thinking of the upcoming year and the turmoil in the marketplace, I always like to come up with themes around kind of top 5 focuses. And as I reflected on the topics that we talked about for prep on this, the thing that kept coming back to me was kind of repositioning and realigning. And you'll see we've identified 5 topics to talk about, and they all have in common this notion of realignment as we prepare for the future. So if you think about the 5 themes, one is how we think about recalibrating pay for performance. Pay for performance is important. We hear it from shareholders all the time. It's not going anywhere, but increasingly it's a challenge when you start thinking about how I set long-term goals when I can't even barely figure out what's going to happen next week. So how we think about recalibrating that pay for performance environment, which ties into the second point, which is when that recalibration fails us despite our best efforts, how are we reviewing the appropriate use of discretion? How board members kind of earn their keep in these hard times. And I'm sure Libby will have a lot to add on that one. A renewed focus on succession planning. We've seen a wave of turnover in the C-suite, not just amongst the CEOs, but amongst other executives, both for voluntary reasons, baby boomers just saying it's time to, to hang it up, as well as involuntary turnover. And the importance of boards staying on top of a robust succession planning process. And then just how we react in real time in an effective way to all of the external stimulus that's getting thrown at us from every direction, socially, politically, the geopolitics of operating in a global environment. And then lastly, we've certainly seen quite a bit of a pendulum around ESG, particularly DEI and climate. And so revisiting the role of ESG in this new environment. So got a lot of stuff to talk about over the next 45 or 50 minutes. We move to the next slide. So let's just dive right in. Let's start with this notion of pay for performance and recalibrating pay for performance. As we think about that, obviously, you look at the pay mix for an executive in today's environment, and the vast majority of an executive's compensation program comes from performance-based equity in a public company, performance-based incentives in a private company, and yet there is increasingly difficult pressures around how I set meaningful multi-year goals in an uncertain environment. And I would say what we're seeing with our clients is a lot of creativity around how those goals get set. Whether it's, balancing total shareholder return with financial metrics where executives feel like they've got a little more control. An interesting evolution of mixing performance periods. So mixing shorter term performance periods where I may be doing not 3-year financial goals, but 1-year financial goals that are added with a multi-year total shareholder return to give me that multi-year performance period. But being more creative around the metrics and the performance measurement period to more reflect the operating realities and the line of sight realities that companies are dealing with. The other two things that we're seeing kind of evolving in the pay for performance space is changing the slope. So we're doing away with that concept of, threshold is 20% below budget and then maximum must be 20% above budget. And really thinking about the slope of that pay for performance relationship to more appropriately align with achievable degrees of difficulty. So we want the award relationship to be reasonable and a stretch, but be viewed as achievable for the participants, and really kind of finding that balance less and have it be more specific to the company and less sort of a cookie cutter approach. And then lastly, we're seeing companies kind of rethink long-term incentive participation, and both in terms of how deep within the organization should we go with long-term incentives, who really can impact long-term performance, as well as what's the appropriate vehicle between time-based awards that are more around participation and retention, and performance-based awards, which are really about who controls the ability to have multi-year impact on the organization and the results. I mean, I don't know, Libby, if any of those kind of feel like they speak to what you're seeing in your clients' companies.
Just about all of them. And I think one thing that's really, really challenging in today's day and age is I think all of us are looking at new strategy and initiatives, and how do we drive growth? And then how do we make sure our objectives are really linked and aligned, use the word alignment, to those strategic objectives that we're setting, and are we really measuring what matters, and can we reward it when it happens the correct way? So yes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and maybe while we're continuing this discussion, we'll do our first poll. Are you using performance-based equity in your current executive compensation structure? And I will say, for those who are in private companies, let's say long-term performance cash, you can answer that as well as being the private company equivalent of performance-based equity. And I'm curious, Libby, one of the things that we're seeing companies think about is that relationship of weighting between performance-based equity and time-based vested equity. Have you guys had that discussion in your companies around what's the right weight between time, which is really around retention, and performance vesting, which is around kind of the alignment to performance?
Yes, and I think over the last few years, we've leaned heavier and heavier into the performance versus the time-based. Mm-hmm. And then every now and then there is the sort of, I forgot what we call it, something like career shares or something that we'll give as more of a retention tool. But when we're setting the LTIs and so forth, it's more of a performance-based program.
Interesting. Yeah, certainly the results of the polling would suggest that the vast majority of participants on the phone do include performance-based equity or performance-based incentives in their long-term incentive programs. Not surprising at all. I do, and I think there will continue to be a focus on what's the right mix. We had seen the pendulum shift, I think, towards heavier and heavier focus on the performance vesting equity. We're starting to see that pendulum swing back a little bit more towards the middle, I think, and it speaks to, all of these things end up being circular and interrelated, right? I think that pendulum swing a little bit more towards the middle around balancing performance with retention partly speaks, and I see Susan nodding her head, she knows where I'm going with this, which is a concern about the retention and succession planning issues, and performance-based equity that zeroes out isn't a very good retention tool.
Exactly.
You need that underlying safety net.
So I'm talking to a board tomorrow about this very topic because we're in the middle of a succession and they've identified the individual. It's an internal, but there are some, 2 individuals who maybe won't get that job. And so they're all over. Talk to us about retention because we got to think this through. We want to hold on to these wonderful people. And how do we do it? And of course, money is one lever. It's one good lever. It isn't the only lever, but it's in this case, it can be important, especially in the short term, just to hold on to them and ensure re-engagement. But yeah, so I can see why it is going that way. And we'll talk more later about succession.
Yeah.
And I think a real challenge for the board I'm on is we're in an industry that's highly dependent on the labor market, which has been so uncertain. And so we're not meeting our goals like we thought we would. And we want to retain people and they're not going to get paid what they thought they were going to. And how do we retain them? And especially our top succession candidates, Susan. So that's, that's very, very challenging for companies because everything is so uncertain and it's not acting the way it normally behaves in terms of the labor market.
I also had another little anecdote today about in a time-based situation, there was a story of a top executive deciding they needed to leave for personal reasons and their stuff had not vested yet. And it was kind of an interesting values decision where the CEO and the board decided to go ahead because they thought this person was so amazing. They needed to take time and they wanted to truly leave, but they sped up the vesting.
They accelerated the vesting.
Exactly. And gave it all to them. And I was like, okay. And they said, we could have been, a lot of companies would have just been like, no, isn't that great? We just have X millions of windfall because that person left. But so as long as people can understand that there could be flexibility or they become afraid of getting locked in with time. And I think it's nice to see that there's sort of a human side to this sometimes, and it's a values-driven side to it that isn't so hard.
What a great segue to our next point, if we can move the slide forward, which is the use of discretion. Increasingly, look at that. Increasingly, when you think about the situations, like you said, Libby, where the market isn't reacting the way we would have expected. We set goals 3 years ago that we thought were perfectly reasonable and perfectly achievable. And it turns out for a whole lot of reasons not to be. And yet what the formula says is generated by the incentive plan, whether it's short-term or long-term, what the formula generates, the board looks at it and says, it just doesn't feel fair. This is where, and Susan, you made the same point, this is where the board steps in and says, and sort of injects a dose of humanity and says, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to break from what the formula said, and we're going to do the right thing. I think the challenge is around boards having some sort of process or structure so that discretion doesn't end up looking arbitrary or one-sided.
Oh, yes. Because once you go down that road, then everyone hears about it. And then it's like, oh, there are exceptions.
And then what is the best way to explain that to the shareholders as well? Have you seen some things that are working well in that area?
Well, I do think that for better or worse, shareholders tend to be more receptive of discretion when it is kept below target. So, discretion that takes an incentive payout from, 60% of target to 85% of target is going to be much more acceptable to shareholders than discretion that takes an award from 95% of target to 110% of target. It's still a 15% move, but the fact that I went 15% and there's something in the minds of shareholders that says, man, once you go over target, we're not so crazy about discretion anymore. As long as you keep it under target, shareholders seem to be more receptive. I will put an asterisk on that to say that in general, I find ISS and Glass Lewis to be unreceptive regardless of the use of discretion or where it falls in the spectrum. Yeah. So I think, recognize that as a board, if you are choosing to exercise discretion, be prepared for ISS and Glass Lewis to have negative commentary about it. In and of itself, is the use of discretion enough to push ISS and Glass Lewis into a no recommendation on say on pay? Not necessarily. But if it's done in conjunction with other things that they don't like, it could end up in a negative vote recommendation.
Okay. Interesting.
I think the other thing that helps is, it can be very helpful if historically you can show that the committee has exercised discretion in both directions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's all about reality, fairness, but clearly what you're saying is when it looks like it's gilding the lily, it really gets noticed.
Absolutely.
Good way to put it. Yeah.
But, I think, there it clearly comes with the need to have more explanation in your CDNA. I have found historically it is helpful to include more history. CDNAs historically tend to only talk about the single year that has just happened. If this is a year where you're exercising discretion, you can be benefited by a little more history as to how we got here and why this is fair. And, have there been examples where you've exercised negative discretion in addition to this positive discretion? So some additional context can be helpful in the process. I want to make sure we should get through, we kind of get to all of our points. So I'm going to move us maybe to the next polling question. And this deals with, now we're moving into some broader non-executive comp issues, into the more human capital management side of things. Do you feel you have a good succession plan in place? Good, I'm going to put in quotes. Good is a relative term. It's running about 50-50. Yes, no. The yeses have it a little bit, but a fair number knows there, Susan.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. This is an area that it's so important, obviously, to a board. It's your number one priority in the end is to select the next CEO, but also to ensure overall senior leadership, that there's a pipeline, et cetera. So why don't we move to the next slide? So succession, I do a whole lot of work in the CEO succession space. And so I'm working with both public and private organizations, very large, Fortune 500 and above, and very small family-owned businesses sometimes. And what's fascinating is it's never that easy. You know, I've never seen an organization that said, oh, you know, our CEO succession process is all buttoned up and it just runs itself or whatever. But today in particular, things are getting more complicated. The CEO job is just a lot tougher. And, you know, it has been sort of going up, but it's kind of taken a big jump in the last 3-4 years, where the complexity of that job, especially external pressure, has really made it hard. And, you know, you see the impact of that on the tenure of our CEOs. It's going down. And so you look at that and you say, well, what is it that we as a compensation committee or a non-gov committee, if it's under the non-gov, or a whole board needs to be thinking about here and doing differently? One of the biggest things that, you know, some people say, well, that seems obvious. Start early. I can't tell you how many boards I talk with, but also CEOs who are, you know, the board will say, well, you know, he or she just started a year ago, or you know, we don't have to start worrying about that yet. Oh, yes, you do. In fact, you should be starting on day one of that new CEO's tenure. So there's this weird feeling of we have time. Well, you don't know. You don't know if your CEO is going to flame out in 2 or 3 years. You don't know, you know, what's going to happen. And it takes so long to develop people who are ready for the C-suite that you really have to be all over this for the long haul. So, you know, if you're looking at a comp committee's focus on talent overall and the development and succession of C-suite, generally comp committees are getting much more involved in this area and asking the management team to go deeper and to show them, how are you building this bench over the next X years so that we will likely have 1 or 2 candidates in 2 years or 3 years that we can seriously say are CEO's succession candidates or candidates for other C-suite positions. So this is a, you know, now you'll get varying opinions. There are sometimes CEOs who are like, honestly, I know we're going to have to go outside, which to me is such a cop-out.
That is awful.
Sorry. No, it's still out there, and boards where there's like this, we don't have it. And it's often because they've never had the internal culture to develop people.
So I will just say I'm on a people compensation and culture committee, and this is one of our strengths. I think we did start maybe not the day after our CEO started, but we certainly were actively in it his first year. And one of the things that's really helped us is our board evaluation. We asked for ideas, and we have gotten a lot of great ideas from board members. Like one idea is that we meet quarterly with up and coming people, couple of layers down, different board members in small groups. And they're virtual meetings a lot of times when they can't be in person, but now we have our radar on leaders years in advance. And that's really good because our CEO has been in place, I think 10 years. So we've had a lot of time to work on this, and our competency priorities are going to change about who we need, but we'll know who we have. And I think that's really important.
That's so important that you bring that up, because a lot of times directors will say, well, I know we need a good process, but we just don't have access to these people. We see them, you know, in the boardroom doing PowerPoint presentations, and honestly, we don't know enough. Like, it's not helping us. So there is this whole idea of how does a board expose itself? How do individual directors, without getting into operations and being annoying, but in a good way, be able to get to know talent at a deeper level so that you can honestly and credibly say, I think we have stuff here beyond what management is telling you. So, and then this whole idea of, you know, it's an assumption that you are looking for talent that is aligned with what you will need to deliver in the future strategically. But not every company, frankly, even has that profile of the future for what the next CEO should look like, or what other C-suite roles might look like. So that's sort of your foundational. If you don't have that, you better get that.
So, Susan, how much of that do you think is driven by the relationship that the CEO has with the board, that the CEO is confident enough in kind of their own skin to talk about their succession, as well as to highlight for the board, here are the high potentials that you guys need to get to know. It just strikes me that so much of that has got to be that willingness and openness to have that relationship at the board level has got to do with the CEO kind of being comfortable in their own skin.
That is so true. In fact, I would say it's almost the swing factor. If you have a CEO who is open-minded and realistic, frankly, about their own succession and will work with the board, that is so key. Unfortunately, there are different models of how this plays out, but sometimes you have the super successful, iconic CEO. We all know who some of those might be. I don't need to name names. I've worked with a few. I have a few right now I'm working with. And if some people become so in love with being the CEO that they don't want to leave, they find all sorts of reasons, and they're very good at manipulating their boards to allow them to continue forever and ever and ever. And there's always a reason why there isn't a successor. And weirdly, the board complies because it's easy. It's like, and they love this successful, iconic figure who they're like, but so-and-so is so amazing. And they seem to have more runway. Let's just let that person go. That's dangerous after a long time. That starts becoming, this is when activists start sniffing around, when they see that something has been going on way too long. And it's usually the more powerful CEOs who can fall into this trap. You also have powerful CEOs who are mature enough and sort of ready enough that they have so carefully planned their succession, it's a fait accompli. So either model play out.
The thing we shouldn't ignore too is the lead director or the chairman, which one's independent. They can really influence that CEO and help
Absolutely.
him or her understand why this is important and why we need to focus on it and why it's not a challenge to them, but it's good board governance. And I've been on the same board almost, 15 years, and I've seen good and not so good. And when you have a good, strong lead director, it really makes a difference.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the other thing. A board can be, I've seen boards where if you look at them individually, you think, wow, these are amazing directors. Look at their credentials. They're like kings and queens of the world, right? Yet, one board I know of like that allowed their CEO to get away with just what I described, and no one took him on. And funny thing, it's one of those after the fact, everybody's going, woulda, shoulda, coulda, and there is no excuse, actually. It's like, wait a minute, no, this was your job. And you just did not do it because it was hard. They had to go up against someone who was strong, who was charming, could be, they maybe revered their board role too much too, the directors, they didn't want to be the one to stick their nose out and get it chopped off. So it's a really interesting dynamic that can occur, and it's a real balancing act.
Well, and I think, when you think about the woulda, coulda, shouldas, I often hear board members say, I wish we had acted sooner. I almost never hear board members say, boy, we pulled the trigger too fast.
Correct. That's right. So anyway, but if you say okay, some of this stuff has existed for a while, what's really different, I'd say today, is just the amount of pressure in this area where you are going to see faster cycles. So boards, comp committees, non-gov committees have to be a little more forward lean on this whole topic and be looking further out on the horizon and going deeper and then demanding to see the lay of the land from management as far as how they're developing those other layers of talent, because there's too much churn and you have to be ready to be able to replace people. And it takes a long time to get some of these people ready.
So I have a couple of other questions. I mean, I again, we've got two more topics we want to touch on, but I do have one other thing that I'm curious about, probably to Susan, maybe to Libby, in terms of how you're seeing it play out in reality is, oftentimes succession historically is, I've got my org chart, it's built, and my succession plan is how do I fill, next man up, who fills the boxes that are in the current org chart. We are now living in a world where AI is going to shift what the org structure looks like. You've got generational change happening in the C-suite, where the boomers are retiring. We've got a new generation coming into those roles. How do you think about the organization of the future and what that does to succession planning, and how creative board members have to be able to see not the company as it is today, but the company as it will be?
That's a good question. I mean,
It is.
it's a good question, and there's no easy answer, but the one thing I would say is, yeah, okay, AI will change many jobs potentially throughout the organization. It will therefore, where you have to distill it at a board level might be initially with the C-suite. How will it therefore change these higher level roles as far as what are they going to be accountable for? Will they start having to be accountable for certain kinds of entities that they never actually had to manage before because they're going to be tech related? Or will they just have fewer people? So some of the requirements of leaders at the top will change, and therefore succession requirements would change.
I think one thing that really helps in seeing it play out, for example, is if you have new initiatives, if you have an acquisition, if you have, a big AI project going on, pick somebody on your succession list at different levels, depending on what the project is, and have them play out a position so you can see how do they adapt to a different role because new initiatives, there's usually a lot of uncertainty and need to be agile. And that helps you at least see, how people could learn new things. And that's been very helpful for us, because sometimes it works really well and you go, what a star. And then sometimes you're like, oh boy,
Right.
That person's really good at what they do, but not at leading a big initiative.
Yeah. So maybe, Libby, I'll put this question to you first, with a follow-up to Susan, which is, one of the buzzwords that you hear about, kind of characteristics for the leader of the future is this buzzword resilience, and how important resilience is. And I'm wondering, historically, when we're looking at kind of the resume for a future leader, we look at operational stuff, how big was the organization they run, how successful, how profitable, blah, blah, blah. How do you test for resilience if you're looking at a future leader, Libby?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a test, but I think watching them when they're in a situation when they have to be resilient is probably the best way to do it. I don't know, Susan, have you discovered some secret test for that?
Well, okay. First of all, resilience, I would say, is one thing. Just being overall agile, like how do you pivot? Are you a person, because all this has to do with how do you react to change? Are you, resiliency? It's like, okay, do I freak out or do I, how do I get through it? To Libby's point, yes, you can see individuals who, when given a task that's going to be all over the place or something that is continually changing, how do they bounce with the ball? And how do they both take it on from a personal perspective? Like, are they are they able to handle it and not become obviously stressed? Are they someone who doesn't allow failure to just demolish them? In a testing situation, I mean, if we're looking for this in an interview process, we often ask individuals to tell us stories about times when something didn't work, or to, when they were in a complex situation where there was no clear outcome and they had to figure it out. So you kind of see how they've reacted, or even provide them with a situation of how would you solve this, and see if they get caught up in a box, or if they're like, well, I don't have the answer, but I guess there's these different sources I could go to initially, and I would figure it out through time by doing, you start seeing how they think. And if they're able to bounce back and move when the earth under them is shaking, or if they freeze, the freezing in place is the person we're worried about.
Yeah.
Interesting. That leads us, I'm mindful of time. That leads me to my next poll, which is speaking about the earth shifting underneath our feet.
Mm-hmm.
What are those external things that you're most concerned about?
Good
And
question.
we've given you 4 choices: AI, tariffs, regulatory pressures more broadly, and DEI and social issues. And it looks like early response, lots of people wondering about the
AI.
impact that AI is going to have on their business.
Yeah. Not surprising.
No, not surprising at all. Not
And
surprising.
the tariffs may have fallen off a bit because everyone's hopeful that something's going to come to fruition, or we're getting used to the new normal. I hate to say it. That's another crazy
Well,
thing.
it's interesting because I think when the tariff thing first came out, speaking, going kind of full circle back to discretion, I think the thinking was the tariff issue, at least with regard to executive compensation, was going to be a 1-year thing, right? It was a problem for 2025 because the tariffs came in after everybody had set their 2025 incentive goals. And so, yes, maybe we would have to exercise discretion for 2025, but for 2026, we would be able to bake in discretion into, we would be able to bake in the impact of tariffs into the budgeting process, so it would be fine. Except that it continues to be such a moving target. We can't really bake it into the budget for 2026 either. I mean, Libby, I don't know what you're seeing on the tariff front and how your company's thinking about the impact that has on budget setting. And
Yeah, since we're not in a business where we're, importing a lot of things from other countries and so forth, but more it's about our clients and how it's affecting our clients. And then, so how do we work with our clients on their labor needs when they are having to face so many of these tariff issues? And it's challenging because it's uncertainty.
So I think it's interesting that the majority said that the biggest stressor is AI. And if we think about that, I mean, it plays out differently, obviously, in different industries and with different organizations. And the ones that probably do it better might be the ones that are more thoughtful and they have a business strategy, but they're not allowing AI to drive everything. So, it's the idea of, this is an amazing tool that we are going to work in as it makes the most sense to drive our business forward in a positive way. And, where there's alignment with the board on this and an understanding of how it's going to impact the business. Now, in some cases, it could be, what's scary and stressing people is it's a great business model decision, but it's also got a huge downside. Like a lot of people may lose their jobs. And there's a whole societal thing here that we're wrestling with about what's okay and what's not okay. Is technology always the answer? So, AI has such amazing, I just came from a hospital system board meeting, and, the chief clinical officer was going through some of their AI applications, and they're amazing in the medical field. I mean, the things that you can do. And I was just, I would say that industry in particular for how it can change clinical care in a good way. Like you can identify cancers earlier, you can do all these things. But then they started talking about the robotic nurse. And then everybody starts getting nervous. So I think boards have every right to be nervous and thoughtful and forward lean and pushing hard on this one because it can go a lot of places.
So my question to Libby on that is, how do you as a board member feel like you're exercising the appropriate amount of oversight on some of these big sort of, company changing focuses without management feeling like you're coming in and stepping on their toes?
Well, I feel like when we are talking about these, management is feeling like we really do want input from our board because we're on uncharted territory. And so who has seen something like this somewhere else? And so when it comes to AI and huge AI projects, which everybody, the majority indicated that's what they're worried about, for example, when I think about some of the ones we have going on, some of the issues that we ask a lot of questions about is how fast do we have to move on this? How much do we want to spend on this? How soon will we see a result?
Yeah.
What will the marketplace think if we are spending more money on this than they think we should? All kinds of questions like that. And when you have a really good board that really knows what they're doing and serves on a lot of other boards, it's very helpful to learn from each other. And I think that's it's all about asking the right questions and bringing the right amount of expertise. And I think the biggest issue is everybody thinks, oh, we got to do this quick and we have to get here first. But are we going to get the return that we expect is really key. So anyway, I think we should get to the Q&A a little bit quickly. But I'm just getting a note that we need to move on.
Move it along.
All right, we'll move to our last topic, and then follow it up with our last polling question. So our last topic is really about ESG, which is the other sort of social issue out there. When you think about, there's been a lot of focus, obviously, a real pendulum swing in the use of emerging ESG metrics, particularly DEI-related metrics and climate-related metrics in incentive plans. We saw a big push, without getting overly political here, I will refrain myself. We saw a big push under the last administration around DEI, around climate-related metrics. We saw a lot of companies put those metrics into their executive incentive plans. That pendulum under the current administration is firmly swinging back in the other direction. A lot of companies, particularly on DEI, have scrubbed all mention of DEI from all of their materials on their websites, taken it out of incentive plans. Libby, think about your own clients. How as a board are you advising your companies to navigate that pendulum swing that is really kind of driven by external political issues more than it's driven by internal kind of management issues?
I think what the companies I've been affiliated with have done is most of us have been very strong in this area anyway, or they wouldn't have an HR person on their board, right? But anyway, we haven't changed our behavior under either administration, but we may have changed our language or the way we talk about it. And that is, fine as long as we don't take away from our core interests in this area and furthering our diversity and inclusion in our organization. So yes.
And then the question is, because see many organizations changing their websites, and they have to in some cases for regulatory reasons. They're going to get slapped if they don't. But there is this weird fallout of, okay, we now don't have this here. How do our employees feel about that? And are they feeling that we still are upholding these things, or is the change of language a signal of something else that we have to be careful to manage?
Yeah, and I think, this really is, what this really highlighted is, you really found out who the bandwagon companies were, right? It's who got on this train just because it was the thing to do, the flavor of the day, flavor of the month, versus, no, we put this in place because it's core to our values and it's what we actually believe in. And you really found out who the bandwagon companies were.
And when it's core to your values and your behavior doesn't change, your people won't question. I don't think, Susan. Yeah,
I agree.
And I think it makes the employee communications super important. I think there's also a recognition that while compensation is one tool to send a message about how important these issues are, it's not the only tool that management has at its at its discretion. There's who gets promoted and why. There's, there are lots of other ways within the whole scope of human capital management where you can send a message to your employee population about how important these things are that goes beyond, it's got a 5% weighting in our bonus plan.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, last polling question. Are you considering taking DEI language out of your goal setting? Yes, we're taking it out. No, we're not taking it out. Or lastly, we already have taken it out. I suppose we should have added another choice of, we never had it in there to begin with.
That's okay. We can figure it out from here.
Interestingly, this one is sort of pretty, relatively evenly split.
Sort of 60-40 though. Yes, either we're taking it out or we already have.
Or we already have. That's true. 64. So we've either taken it out or we already have, or no, we're leaving it in. And I think, I think, Susan, you made the point. In some cases, companies felt like, because they have government contracts or other reasons, like we don't have a choice.
Oh, right? No. They're being literally screened.
So. We don't have a choice.
Yeah.
We have a lot of great questions out there and not time for too many of them, but I see a lot around succession. And one is for Susan, how do you, or maybe also I think we all might have a point, but how do you get boards to get to know lower levels of management in a non-intrusive way so that the board can really get a good idea of bench strength?
Well, there are a couple different things. You can, first and foremost, expose board members to maybe special projects where individuals are leading these projects. And you might invite that board member to witness a presentation, at the company, or to have a lunch with the individual to talk about the project. There can be mentoring situations where you assign board members to level down employees as some kind of a mentor, especially when they have a common interest. Like someone could actually learn from the board member because the board member has deep expertise. That's a great way. The only little caveat I would say with mentorship from board is just be careful it doesn't turn into a cheerleading thing where the board member is sort of siding with one individual over another because of their mentoring relationship. So you gotta be careful with that. Just participation of the board in strategy meetings, like making sure there's a commingling of the management team on certain strategic topics, sometimes companies are having management board offsites where they all work together on reviewing some of the big strategic plans. And this is where they get to break bread together, have dinners together, and get to know people at a much deeper level. So it's time, and it's not Zoom meetings, by the way. I think the Zoom is okay, but it's going to be more in-person stuff where you can be exposed to individuals, both one-on-one and in groups.
Well, I agree with all of that, and would just say make it a way of life. And it takes a while, but it has to be a deliberate action on the board.
Yes.
But we have done pretty much all of those things, Susan, and it's pretty good.
Yeah, and I think usually the CEO has to sort of give people permission too, because there's a little bit of a dance sometimes where unless the CEO says, I want my board to know my people, okay, great. I've seen a few boards where the CEO is like, I am so upset that so-and-so talked to this, like you have to have parameters set of what's okay and what's not okay, because you don't want to have the board like running around behind your back as a CEO doing stuff that you're not aware of that might be disruptive. But on the other hand, you want a nice feeling that they can talk to your people. So setting those boundaries and sort of how it works and that it's okay and it's a good thing.
So I will ask another question, not about succession, but for Jan. If a company has things that are not contemplated in the plan, like a legal settlement or a facility shutdown, is that acceptable for discretionary, discretion by the committee?
I would say yes, with caveats. I think those are great examples of things that would absolutely fall under where we typically see as a use of discretion, one-time events that would truly fall into the category of extraordinary items. I think the challenge there is a couple-fold. One is if you have an extraordinary item every single year, at some point it stops being extraordinary.
Yeah.
And my second caveat would be if you're going to protect the management team on the downside, we insulated them from the negative impact of a legal settlement, then let's make sure that we've got a similar, that we remember that on the upside. The next time a legal settlement goes in our favor and we get a windfall of a settlement, that gets X'd out as well. So I think it's making sure that if you're doing something where you're going to protect management from the downside harm, you need to look to the future and make sure that they're not going to get the benefit of any subsequent upside that comes from that action.
Thanks. I see Mary's here to round us out. It's so amazing how fast our time goes on these things, but I thought it was great. Thank you, ladies. Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. And thank you, ladies, so much for, all of this great information. And, while we ran out of time, again, we never have enough time, right, for these Q&As. For all of those who submitted some really great questions, I saw them come through, just know that the panel will follow up with you via email as long as you gave your name. A couple of quick little reminders for you. One, please remember to fill out the evaluation form in the attendee hub or at the link that comes in the follow-up email. As I mentioned, this feedback is essential for us to really improve our webinar series. And I want to remind everybody that, we do these webinars with Meyer once a quarter. So be on the lookout for 2026 and for these compensation committee series webinars to continue through. You can learn more and register on our webinar page once we get that up. As always, you can find this webinar and all of our previous webinars from the compensation committee series on our webinars page, nacdonline.org/webinars, and go to archives, or you can go to the Meyer site as well. This concludes our program. We wish you all a wonderful afternoon and happy holidays. We'll see you in 2026.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.